Well, today, maybe you've noticed that we're picking up after Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem, after he cursed the fig tree, and then after he cleansed the temple. So this is where we're at, kind of in the context. And as we begin looking at our text today, I would like you to think back with me, if you would, to the time of the Exodus. Now, my hope in doing this is that we could take our text here and to magnify it for the purpose of better understanding it and having a better sense of the reason why it relates to our lives. I want us to travel back to the time of the Exodus so that we'll develop a heightened sense of our need for Mark chapter 11, verses 20 through 26. To say this in another way, while this passage is immensely important, like every text in the Bible is, I think we simply will not give as much attention to this as we should unless we kind of turn up the heat and see a situation in which we look at it and say, oh, now I see why I should give this text my time and attention. I think if we don't look at something else, again, turn up the heat, we'll look at this text and we'll kind of treat it like peas on our plate and just kind of scoot it to the side. Yeah, I know it's good, I know it's healthy, but is it really that important? So, with this being said, let's think back to the time of the Exodus. A Pharaoh comes to power who does not know Joseph. A Pharaoh is essentially the king of this great empire, this mighty empire during the time. And he does not know Joseph, meaning he doesn't know the story of how the whole Israel tribe came into the land. He does not know Joseph, and he looks out in his empire that he rules, and he has this concern of, here's this host, here's this mass of people. What if they rise up and try to overtake our kingdom? The Egyptians were really good at trying to keep out foreign enemies. But here the Pharaoh realizes there's a potential for enemies to rise up from within us. So what does Pharaoh do? He enforces strict, rigorous labor upon the Israelites. He forces them into bondage, into slavery, to work in their fields, to build bricks for their cities. And if that was not bad enough, what else? It escalates to the point that Pharaoh gathers the midwives together and he tells them, if the Hebrew women, if the Israelite women have a son, they are to do what? Put them to death. Well, this of course leads God's people to cry out to Yahweh. And if we fast forward 8 decades, God appears to a shepherd named Moses, and he tells Moses that he has seen and that he's heard the affliction of his people. Just as a quick side note, this should grant us much comfort in our lives. That God hears the affliction of his people. That he's fully aware of the woes and the trials that we go through. So he hears them. He tells Moses that. And then, fast forward again, he sends Moses to Pharaoh to tell Pharaoh to what? Let my people stay. No. Let my people go. And of course, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He's resistant to this. He enforces greater amounts of labor upon the Israelites. And so then God sends forth plagues to help change Pharaoh's heart, to help set his captives free. Well, plague 1 comes, nothing much changes. Plague 2, plague 3, all the way there's 9 plagues here, and God's people are still in Egypt. Pharaoh still refuses to let the Israelites go. Well, then there comes this 10th plague. And before it, what does God tell Moses? He says, one more plague I will bring about on Pharaoh and Egypt. And after that, he will let you go. This is the good news. Finally, freedom. But there's more to the message. not only will you receive freedom, but also as you leave, you will find favor in the Egyptian sights, and they will give you their gold and their silver. Now here's the big question. How do you think they would have felt as they were leaving, finally tasting freedom, and receiving gold and silver from their enemies? Imagine pretty well. Pretty good. Cloud 9 experiences this tremendous joy. Now think back in your own lives when you've tasted God's goodness and you've experienced God's blessing beyond measure in your life. Perhaps salvation, of course. Maybe a birth of a child or whatever else. But we think of those experiences, those times of how great our God is, that my God loves me and I love my God. Now, coming back to the Exodus and the Israelites, they're making their way out of Egypt. God's directing them, and He tells Moses, well, why don't you set up camp at the edge of the sea? Moses says, no problem, we can do that. And so here's God's people encamped at the edge of the sea, and something happens to Pharaoh. He changes his mind, and the Israelites look out, and they see the Egyptians. They've come to capture the Israelites once again. They've changed their mind. No, you can't experience freedom. And so here the Israelites are pressed in, they're boxed in, and here's this great army, experienced and trained. The Israelites, not trained in military, not trained in battle, regardless of that latest Exodus movie with Christian Bale. That's not the biblical account. They're untrained. And what do these people do? Consider now, these are people who have personally tasted the deliverance of God. They have personally bore witness to the goodness and faithfulness of God, thus again leading to immense joy and faith as they're leaving Egypt. And now they find themselves in this pressing, this terrible situation. And how does the camp of God's people respond? Exodus 14, verses 10 through 12. As Pharaoh drew near, the sons of Israel looked, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they became very frightened, so that the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord. Verse 11. Then they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you dealt with us in this way, bringing us out of Egypt? And then verse 12. Is this not the word that we spoke to you in Egypt, saying, leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness. They first respond to this trying and pressing situation by demonstrating an utter lack of faith. An utter lack of faith. And though we can open up our Bibles today, we can read that Exodus account, and we can look at this group of people, God's people, who have tasted, again, the first hand of God's mercy and His grace, and in our flesh say, I don't get it. I can't believe these people who experienced the plagues, who've seen so many wondrous things, who were led out of Egypt by the right hand of the Lord. I can't believe that their faith wavered so drastically. Now I say, in the flesh, for there's no other way for us to do so. Because who among us has not demonstrated a lack of faith after tasting the goodness and faithfulness of God? If we're honest, not one of us. We've all experienced times, some situation in which we've demonstrated a lack of faith in God. And it is this, a lack of faith, that leads to our text today and our need for it. So with this being said, I want you to look with me at Mark chapter 11 once again. I want us to look at the first two verses in our text today. Mark chapter 11, verses 20 and 21. As they were passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots up. And being reminded, Peter said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered. Well, here we observe what we witnessed with the Israelites back during the Exodus, and what we have also experienced in our own lives, and that is a lack of faith. Now, this will not take long, and I think it's easily observable, but we must concern ourselves with what Peter says. For like other passages, it serves as the springboard for the dialogue that transpires. So, just in case there are individuals who might think, well, maybe I'm being a little hard on Peter. Is this really a lack of faith? Let me offer up some support. First, Jesus responds by instructing him and the other disciples to have what? Faith. This, of course, would be of little sense unless Peter's statement pertaining to this fig tree was motivated by the element of faith or the lack thereof. Second, Matthew's account, which, again, Matthew's account is dealt with topically and not chronologically. So if you look at the two accounts of Mark and Matthew, they seem like they don't match up. There's a reason for that. Okay? But in Matthew's account, it helps demonstrate that their reaction is caused by disbelief. Because in Matthew 21, verse 20, we read this. Seeing this, the disciples were amazed and asked, how did the fig tree wither all at once? The disciples see this fig tree wither and then, how? How did this happen? And the disciples' amazement was not brought on by a lack of knowledge. They knew how it happened. They saw Jesus curse it, but their amazement was brought upon by a lack of faith. Undoubtedly, Peter's and the other disciples' faith should have led to a belief that what happened to the fig tree would be expected and therefore not worth noting with a sense of inquiry. Think about this. No one puts oil in their vehicle, oil that's almost clear with a slight tint of tan, and then drives their vehicle for 3 months, some maybe 6 months or a year. I don't know how you change your oil. But then change your oil, and you see the oil coming out, and it's pitch black. And nobody goes, look at the oil, it's turned. What's up? It's expected. So we don't make a comment about it. Or think about this, if we go out to dinner, if we go to Ninja Steakhouse and we have a meal and let's say it's just $15. And we give them not if your whole family's there, Keith, so in that case it'd be $500. So anyway, but you're there and you're anywhere and it's $15. And your waitress comes and you give them a $50 bill. When the waitress returns and we open up the little whatever that is, I don't even know. Anyway, and we see change there, we don't shout to everybody in the restaurant, look, I received my change back. No, we have given that money by faith that they're going to bring us change. As a matter of fact, it's to be expected. Again, what we are witnessing first in our text is a lack of faith. Now, the situation here in our text is not as pressing, it's not as dramatic as other ones recorded in Scripture. That's why it took us back to the Exodus narrative. Thus, why it began to, so we see the Israelites in this pressing and trying situation to intensify the underlying problem in our text. Though not as grave nor captivating, this lack of faith found in our text is a problem that rings true for God's people throughout the corridor of time. We go back to the Old Testament, we can look at the 12 spies that went into the Promised Land. They came back, and 10 of them gave a bad report. There's fortified cities, these giants, these warriors. We fast forward and we think of the time of Judges as God comes to Gideon. Gideon, I want you to deliver my people. Gideon does not immediately say, okay. He says, well, first, let me put out a fleece, and if it's wet with dew and the ground around it is dry, then I will go. And of course, if we fast forward past biblical times to our times today, we experience such times as well. God's people will experience situations in which they will demonstrate a lack of faith. For some, it's a bill. How am I going to pay this? For some, it's physical health. How will I make it through this? For some, it's during adversity. For some, it's during seasons of drought. For some, it has to do with their family. For some, it has to do with their church. Think back in your own lives and the various times in which you perhaps demonstrated a lack of faith. Taking note that a lack of faith is something that God's people struggle with. This is something that I struggle with. And this is something in which you, in the midst of life and all the things that come up, all the difficulties that present themselves, this is something that you probably are not immune to either. Therefore, the question, what are we to do? If we are to be a people of faith and faithful in any circumstance, and yet we see God's people struggle time and time and time again, what are we to do? This now brings us to the response of Jesus. Look with me in your Bibles, if you will, at verse 22 of our text. Mark 11:22. And Jesus answered, saying to them, have faith in God. So we have in our text a band of men who demonstrate a lack of faith, not unfamiliar to our own selves. And in response, Jesus responds with a reminder of faith. Jesus responds with a gentle rebuke and command. This was an imperative, a command to his disciples, and by extension to us today. And Jesus commands his disciples in the realm of faith. And please note, Jesus does not simply say, well, you need to have faith. That's not where the period ends. Rather, Jesus denotes that his disciples are to have faith in, meaning faith that is grounded in a particular object, specifically faith in God. This is what separates those who belong to God and those who do not. Everyone exercises faith in something. Everyone has some object that they place their faith in. This is a similarity among mankind. For us here today, for those in other congregations of cults and false religions, those in mass stadiums as they gather to watch NFL games, everybody's placing their faith in something. In fact, Paul Tripp, he's a man that some of us have seen or went through a couple of Bible studies with, and if you're not familiar with Paul Tripp, I'd highly recommend him to you. We call him Mr. Mustache. If you can't see that up there, he has a huge mustache. And in his Bible study that we did called Faith, he said this: Christians are not different because they live by faith. Christians are different because of the object of their faith. This is to say, everyone has faith. The difference, however, is what individuals place their faith in. For some, it's their bodies. Some go to great lengths, extend great amount of energy and resources to maintain their body, because that's where their hope is. For some, it has to do with their savings account. Well, everything will be okay as long as I have enough money in the bank. For others, it's their education. For others, it's work ethic, and so on and so forth. Once again, from Tripp, he says, everyone hooks their hope into something. I need to ask you this morning, what are you hooking your hope in? Is it God? Or is it something else? And if it is something else, I would urge you to raise up your anchor and cast it into Christ. That everything else in this world will fail you. Everything else will not provide what you need in the end. That it is only Christ that grants us eternal hope. That He is the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through Him. Have you cast your hope in Christ? I pray so. pray so. And for those of us who have cast our anchor in Christ, the reminder in our text is that for those who belong to God, no matter the situation, we are to place our faith in God. This presents a question, I think, why? Out of the vast number of objects to place one's faith in, why God? Now, this is not an all-inclusive list, but I do want to mention some reasons. First, He's perfect. We went through this on Wednesday night a few weeks ago. God's will is perfect. He is perfect. He's performing a perfect work in His people. We can put our hope and faith in God because He is perfect. Further, He's omnipotent. He's all-powerful. He can do all things. Nothing else is able to do that. He's omniscient. He's all-knowing. He has all wisdom. How about this one? He's all-loving.
Amen.
He's sovereign. He's completely in control of everything. And then He's also true and living. Hebrews 10:31 says, "It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God." There's only one living God, and it is our God, Yahweh. Think about this in 1 Thessalonians 1:9. Paul says, "For they themselves report about us what kind of reception we had with you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God." So many people worship idols, false gods, who are not living. Remember back to Elijah on Mount Carmel as he gathers the prophets of Baal, where he says, we're going to find out whose God is real, Baal or Yahweh. He gathers the prophets. He lets the prophets of Baal have their first opportunity. And there they are, cutting themselves, crying out. And there is no voice. There is no action. Why? Because Baal is dead. He is false. He does not exist. He's not living. He's not true. Now it comes to Elijah's time, and he tells the people, hey, why don't you get buckets and drench this sacrifice? Soak it so wet. Soak it wetter than the men on men's retreat this year who drove in the boat and went through the rain. I want it completely soaking wet. In fact, there's water around the sacrifice now. And Elijah prays out to the one true and living God, and he responds. This is the God who we're called to put our faith in. Brothers and sisters, allow me to say one more thing before we move on. These simple and obvious words that Jesus gives to His disciples in our text of study are words that we need to hold on to and let them continually echo in our minds and hearts. Have faith in God. Have faith in God. This is one of the best things about my profession, my calling. That I get up here, or I'm teaching down there, or I'm conversing with somebody during a meal or in their house. My message is the same no matter what. Have faith in God.
Amen.
When we are having trouble in our marriages, when our spouses are distant, uncaring, self-absorbed, have faith in God. When we are having trouble with wayward and rebellious children who seem hardened and disrespectful and cold and callous to the things of God, we are to have faith in God. When we are having trouble in church, because every church, no matter where, experiences rocky seasons, rough seas, in those times, we are to have faith in God. When we are having trouble in or with, and you can fill in your own blank, with whatever it is, and we feel like there's no way, no how, no hope, have faith in God. All while remembering the God whom we are called to have faith in. So we've noted a lack of faith, and then the response Jesus gives in light of this, have faith in God. But if we look at our text, we notice that Jesus does not stop here, but He continues to expound upon what He has just said. So if you will, join me in your Bibles one last time as we look at verses 23 through 26. Mark 11, 23 through 26. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says is going to happen, it will be granted him. Therefore I say to you, all things for which you pray and ask, believe that you have received them, and they will be granted you. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father who is in heaven will also forgive you your transgressions. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father who is in heaven forgive your transgressions. So Jesus has given a reminder of faith, and now we observe that he gives a lesson in faith. Now, as we look at this lesson in faith Jesus gives, we're going to be noting three elements. Three elements, but before we look at these three elements, I want us to see, what does faith accomplish? What can faith accomplish? Have you ever thought about this? We are called to be people of faith, but what can it truly accomplish? Well, we take note with Jesus' words about this mountain here being cast into the sea. Here we see a phrase that our men of this church are very familiar with, if you've ever used our restroom. But this moving a mountain was a metaphor in Jewish literature for doing what seemed impossible. Let me read that again. So as we read that text and Jesus' words about this faith being able to cast a mountain to the sea, this was a metaphor in Jewish literature for doing what was seemingly impossible. Thus, what can faith accomplish? What does faith do? The impossible. The impossible. Here we see an analogy or figure of speech intended to teach a spiritual principle. In extra-biblical Jewish literature, rabbis who demonstrated an unusual ability to solve a very difficult problems were sometimes referred to as removers or uprooters of mountains. What did that imply? Well, they seemed that they could do the impossible. So now that we can see what faith can do, let's now turn to these three elements in the lesson of faith at hand. First, Jesus begins with a negative denial. Do not doubt. Doubt, diakroneo, is talking about debating an issue of dispute, to argue, as being undecided within oneself, to hesitate, to waver. And where is this doubting not to take place? Jesus says, in the heart, the cardia, speaking of the central aspect of one's being. This speaks of the seat of the sensibilities, the affections, the emotions, the desires, the appetites, and passions. Do not doubt in your heart. This doubt, to give you an example, this is what the Chiefs fans did not experience last week before the Raiders game. We were confident. There was no wavering of deciding, well, do we think the Chiefs will win or not? No, we were resolutely convicted and committed to they will win. However, after the first quarter, probably there was some doubt. Is our defense really not this good? This debating within ourselves. This is what Jesus is saying. Do not doubt. Further, the instruction given by Jesus here, and does not doubt in his heart, is not speaking of or referring to doubting one's faith. The caution here is against doubting in this specific object of the faith, namely God himself. When we doubt, we're actually doubting God's nature, his power, his character. We're doubting those many attributes of God that causes us to place our faith in him in the first place. Dear brothers and sisters, why should we doubt? After all, as Andrew Murray writes, we have a God who delights in impossibilities. Think back throughout your lives, I imagine that God has done some impossible things that you stood back in time and go, I'm just overwhelmed. How could this have been? How did this get brought about? Now, in order to help us reflect over this, allow me to ask you an intriguing question regarding faith and doubt. Why do we have trouble trusting in God when we trust in other individuals that do not possess any of his grand attributes? Isn't that interesting? that many of us, I hope, know individuals that we could trust in no matter the situation. That if we were coming back from a 10-hour journey, and it's 2 or 3 a.m., and we're 2 hours away from our city, and we have car difficulties, don't know what to do, I imagine some of us have faith in individuals that we, no matter what, we know if we call them. We know if we call Lee or Keith or Shiloh or whoever else, they would be there. They may not be happy, but they would be there. They would be there. But yet, when it comes to God, who's infinitely more, we doubt His character. We doubt in those times. Oh, dear saints, may we endeavor in our hearts to have faith in God and not doubt in our hearts. For we serve a glorious God who has never given us seeds to sprout the slightest doubt in our hearts. God has never given us any reason to doubt Him. Now Jesus begins with the negative, and He now moves to the positive. He says, believe. Do not doubt. Believe. This is the complete other end of the spectrum here. Believe here means to be persuaded, to think to be true, to be committed, to be convicted. We see this with Noah, who God speaks to him to begin building this ark. And for years, decades, he's convicted of the truth, and he acts, he believes. So we are to believe in this word that we have received. Lambano, it means to lay hold of, to seize, to capture, to apprehend. And note this, here in our text, we must believe in the present tense that we have received in the past tense. This is how our faith is to be worked out and practiced. That presently we're believing that something has already occurred, that God has already proven Himself true, who's delivered us. Now, as we come to these verses in our text, please allow me to say that here we must proceed with caution. We must be extremely careful with these verses. These verses has led to the assimilation of a complete theology that has permeated through most of American evangelicalism, the American church culture at large, and has caused much misinterpretations, mishaps, and misunderstandings. We must understand the words of Jesus here in our text in light of the teaching of the entire Scriptures on faith and prayer. So we must believe and we activate that, or we act on that in prayer. But we see in Scriptures we must ask with first godly motives. James 4 says, "You ask and not receive." Why? Because